The morning I finally understood what had happened, I was standing in my own hallway, not doing anything, not going anywhere, just standing there, still wearing my coat, grocery bags in both hands, staring at the wall in front of me like I'd never seen it before. The wall had been painted, a soft, muted sage green, the kind of color that looks like it belongs in a magazine, the kind that people call sophisticated and timeless. It was, objectively, a beautiful color. It wasn't my color. It wasn't my choice. And on the small wooden shelf below the coat hooks, the shelf Frank built from a piece of reclaimed oak he'd found at an estate sale in Milwaukee, the shelf I had touched every single morning for 22 years without thinking about it, there was a framed photograph I didn't recognize at first. It took me a moment. Then I realized I did recognize it. It was Danny and Raina's wedding photo, the one from the ceremony in Bend. A beautiful photograph. Raina in ivory, Danny with his father's jaw and his father's eyes, and that particular way he has of standing very still when something matters to him. A beautiful photograph, in the spot where Frank and I used to be. Our photo, the one from Crater Lake in 1989, the one where Frank is laughing at something I'd said, and I'm half turned toward the camera, and the water behind us is so blue it almost looks painted. That photograph was gone from the hallway. I found out later it had been moved to my bedroom. For safekeeping, Raina said, so it wouldn't fade in the light. I stood in that hallway for a long time with my grocery bags and my coat, and the particular kind of stillness that comes over you when something finally becomes undeniable. Then I put the groceries away, made coffee, sat down at Frank's table, and I decided to tell you the whole story. Not the version I'd been telling myself for months, the version where I was patient and reasonable and wronged. The real version, the one where I was also, at certain moments, afraid and confused and wrong about things in ways that mattered. My name is Margaret Calloway. Most people call me Marge. I'm 63 years old. I taught high school English literature for 28 years at a school in Portland, Oregon. I have been a widow for 15 years. I want to start there, with Frank, because this story is really about a house, and you can't understand a house without understanding the person who built it. Frank Calloway was a civil engineer who loved three things above all else: good coffee, difficult crossword puzzles, and growing things in difficult soil. He was not a sentimental man in the way people usually mean when they say sentimental. He didn't make speeches. He didn't cry at movies. He expressed love through action. Through the dovetail joints he hand-cut for the bookshelves in the living room, through the way he always made sure my car had gas in it before a long drive, through the dogwood tree he planted in the backyard the week our son Daniel was born. "A tree is a promise," Frank told me once, standing at the kitchen window looking out at that dogwood. "You plant one when you plan to stay." We stayed for 31 years on Birchwood Lane. Frank died of pancreatic cancer in the spring 15 years ago. He was 61. It was fast, 4 months from diagnosis to the last morning, and even at the end he was more concerned with making sure I knew where the circuit breaker panel was and which neighbor to call if the gutters needed clearing than he was with anything else. That was Frank. The house on Birchwood Lane is a 1971 Craftsman with good bones and a wide porch and a kitchen with a 6-chair oak table that Frank bought at an estate sale because, as he said, you never know when the house will be full. In the 15 years since Frank died, I have rattled around in it more or less contentedly. My sister Carol lives in Bend, 2.5 hours south. My best friend June Whitfield, who I've known since we were student teachers together in 1981, lives 12 minutes away. I have a garden that gets out of control every August, and a reading chair by the west window that catches the afternoon light just right, and a sofa in the living room that belonged to Frank and me and has springs that have been mostly gone since 2014. I know every sound this house makes. I know which stair creaks, which window sticks, which corner of the back porch gets ice in February. I know where the light falls at 6 in the morning in January, and where it falls in June, and how different those two things are. This is the house I said yes in. When my son Danny asked if he and his wife could stay for a few months, I want you to understand what I said yes to. Danny is 34 years old. He has Frank's jaw and Frank's way of going very still when something matters to him. and he works as a project manager for a logistics company in Seattle. He is careful with money, thoughtful in most of the ways that count, and when he's nervous, he rubs the back of his neck with one hand. Something Frank did too. Something I don't think Danny knows he does. He came alone on a Sunday afternoon in late February. Raina, his wife, had brunch plans with colleagues. We sat at the kitchen table and he told me, practically and without drama, that the housing market in both Portland and Seattle had moved faster than they'd planned for, that their savings were good, but not yet where they needed to be, and that he was wondering if they might be able to stay with me for a few months. Just until things stabilized. Just until June, probably, while they figured out next steps. He was 34 years old. He was my son. He looked exactly like his father when he was asking for something he wasn't sure he deserved. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I want to be honest about something, though, because I said I was going to tell you the real version. In the 3 seconds between when I understood what he was asking and when I said yes, I had a thought. It was quick, the kind of thought that moves through your mind so fast you almost don't catch it. The thought was, how will Raina be, living here? Then I pushed it aside. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself that was the kind of small, unkind thing that mothers-in-law think and should not say. I told myself I barely knew Raina, and I wasn't going to let a vague instinct become a prejudice. So I said yes, and I smiled. And Danny's whole body relaxed in the way it does when he's been carrying something heavy and sets it down. I have thought about those 3 seconds many times since. Raina Voss Calloway is 30 years old. She's tall, with dark hair she keeps pulled back, and she has a precision about her that you notice immediately. The way she folds things, stacks things, straightens things on surfaces without seeming aware she's doing it. She is a financial analyst, very good at her job by all accounts, and she has opinions about most things and expresses them with the calm certainty of someone who has done the math. She called me Margaret from the beginning. Not Marge, not Mom, or any version of it. Margaret, which nobody had called me since my own mother died. I didn't mention it. I assumed it was her way. When I first met Raina, 18 months before all of this, at a dinner Danny had arranged carefully at a restaurant in the Pearl District, she was polite in a way that felt slightly rehearsed. Interested in me in a way that felt like she was completing a task. I remember thinking that she was performing her best self for the occasion, and that most people do that, and I should give her room to relax into something more natural. I gave her that room. What I didn't know then, what I would only learn much later, and only by accident, was the particular shape of Raina's history. The particular reason why natural was a more complicated destination for her than it was for most people. But I'm getting ahead of myself. They moved in on March 1st. I had made up the guest room with the good quilt and cleared half the closet and put fresh towels in the hall bathroom. I had, I will admit, cleaned the house with slightly more intensity than usual. The first 6 weeks were genuinely fine. Better than fine in some ways. Raina was tidier than me. Tidier than I'd been since before retirement, when I'd had neither the time nor the energy for it. She kept the bathroom spotless and wiped the kitchen counters after every meal and folded her laundry the same day it came out of the dryer, which is something I have aspired to and never achieved. She kept to herself in the evenings, mostly. The door to the guest room closed by 9. She didn't comment on my television habits or my organizational systems or the slightly chaotic state of the corner of the kitchen where I keep the mail. Danny cooked on Sundays. Proper meals. Roast chicken, pasta with real sauce, once an ambitious beef stew that made the whole house smell extraordinary. Sometimes the 3 of us ate together at Frank's table, and it was almost pleasant. Raina would answer questions about her work with clear, precise explanations that I found genuinely interesting. She knew more about Jeopardy! Categories than anyone I'd ever watched with. I remember one evening in mid-March, washing dishes after dinner while Danny dried and Raina sat at the table finishing a glass of wine. And we were talking about something. I don't even remember what. Something inconsequential. And I thought, this is fine. This is actually fine. I should have paid more attention to the small things I was noticing and choosing not to think about. The first one was small enough that I've wondered since whether I imagined it being meaningful. I came home from grocery shopping one afternoon in mid-April, and there were new dish towels on the oven handle. Mine were white with a narrow navy stripe, the same kind I'd used for years, bought at a Saturday market in Ashland the summer Frank and I drove down the coast for our anniversary. Not special, not irreplaceable. White dish towels with a blue stripe. These were charcoal gray with a small geometric pattern and a loop at the top for hanging. They were perfectly nice dish towels. Better than mine, probably, in any practical sense. They were not mine. I stood in the kitchen looking at them for a moment. Then I put the groceries away. Then I made a cup of tea and sat down, and I thought, it's dish towels. You are not going to become the kind of woman who has a conflict about dish towels. And I let it go. I have thought about that moment many times. Not because of the dish towels. They were dish towels. They didn't matter. But because of what I did in that moment. Because of the voice I used on myself. It doesn't matter. It's small. Don't make a fuss. What I was really doing, I understand now, was training myself not to respond. Every time I used that voice, I was teaching myself that my reaction to things in my own home was the problem, not the things themselves. And without knowing it, I was also teaching Raina something. I was teaching her that when she changed something and I saw it and said nothing, that meant yes. I never said yes. But silence, it turns out, sounds just like it. I called Carol the following week. Carol is my older sister, 2 years older, lives in Bend, has the kind of directness that some people find alarming and I have always found mostly clarifying. Can I ask you something? I said. Obviously, said Carol. Am I being too sensitive? There was a pause. Carol doesn't pause for effect. She pauses when she's actually thinking. About what specifically? I told her about the dish towels, about the feeling I'd had since they moved in, a low, unnamed unease that I couldn't locate precisely. Carol was quiet for a moment longer. Marge, she said finally, I'll answer your question, but first I want to ask you one. Are you looking at Raina through the lens of what Frank would have wanted in a daughter-in-law? I didn't answer right away. Because if you are, Carol continued, that's not fair to her. Frank had a particular idea of how a home should feel. Not everyone who walks into your house is going to match that idea. That doesn't mean they're wrong. I sat with that. I sat with it for several days, actually. Carol wasn't dismissing what I'd said, but she was asking me to look at myself first. And she wasn't wrong that I had, somewhere in the back of my mind, an image of what it would look like to have someone in my home who fit. And that image had Frank's fingerprints all over it. I tried to hold both things at once, the unease, and the question of whether the unease was entirely justified. I wasn't sure. I was still not sure in April when the dish towels appeared. I was still not sure in May when the linen closet was reorganized. I told myself it didn't matter. There was one thing I noticed in those early weeks that I didn't know what to do with. Raina never talked about her family. I don't mean she avoided the subject dramatically. No visible tension, no changed expression, no quick subject changes. She simply never mentioned them. Not her parents, not siblings, not childhood, not where she grew up. Danny had told me early on, gently with a slight shake of his head that meant don't push, that Raina's background was complicated and that she preferred not to discuss it. I respected that. I had students for 28 years who preferred not to discuss things, and I learned a long time ago that the privacy someone keeps around their own pain is usually the shape of the pain itself. So I didn't ask. But I noticed. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late April. I had been to the library, then the pharmacy, then the small Korean grocery on Hawthorne that carries the particular brand of sesame oil I like. I came home and set my bags on the kitchen counter, and there it was. An envelope on the table. Opened. Face up. I wasn't trying to read it. I want to be clear about that. I set my bag down next to it and I saw in the upper left corner the return address before I understood what I was seeing. Oregon Department of Human Services Foster Care and Adoption Records Unit. I stopped. I looked at the envelope for a long moment. I did not pick it up. I did not read what was inside. But I understood. Raina had grown up in the Oregon foster care system. I stood at that kitchen table and I felt something shift. Not dramatically, not like a door slamming, but like a slow adjustment of light, the way the quality of an afternoon changes when a cloud moves. I was looking at the same kitchen I'd been looking at all morning. It felt different. Not because I felt sorry for Raina. I want to be careful about that. Pity is a condescending emotion, and Raina Voss Calloway has never struck me as someone who would want it or tolerate it. But I felt something else. A recalibration. A quiet, uncomfortable sense that the story I had been telling myself about what was happening in my house, the story where Raina was unsentimental and slightly careless and indifferent to what things meant to other people, might be missing something essential. A person who grew up in the foster care system had grown up, by definition, in other people's homes, in spaces that were never fully theirs, that could be taken away, that changed without warning, in spaces where the objects around you were chosen by someone else, arranged by someone else, meaningful to someone else. I stood at the table and I thought about the dish towels, and I thought, what if this isn't carelessness at all? I did not have an answer. I still wasn't sure I was asking the right question, but I looked at that envelope and I felt the solid, certain shape of my own narrative start to soften at the edges. That evening at dinner, Raina was exactly as she always was. Precise, composed. She talked about a project at work, asked Danny about a meeting he'd had, thanked me for the soup. I watched her in a way I hadn't before, looking for something I couldn't name. I didn't find it. Not that night. But I was looking. I told myself that one envelope didn't change anything. I was wrong. It changed everything. Just not in the way I expected. The dish towels were just the beginning. I want to tell you what it feels like when someone takes over your space gradually, because I think unless you have experienced it yourself, the description sounds like an overreaction. It sounds like the complaint of someone who is difficult or rigid or too attached to things that don't matter. It isn't dramatic. There is no single morning where you wake up and everything is different. There is instead a slow accumulation, small changes, each one individually explainable, each one individually deniable, until one day you look around the place you have lived for 3 decades and the ratio has shifted. Your things are still physically present, but the house has acquired a different atmosphere. It breathes differently. The defaults have changed. And you, who built this place, who planted your life inside these walls one ordinary day at a time, find yourself moving through it carefully. The way a guest might. That is what happened to me between May and August of that year. And what I didn't understand until much later was that I was not the only one in that house who was trying to survive inside it. May came in warm, which Portland does sometimes as a kind of apology for April. I was spending more time in the garden than usual. The wisteria I'd planted along the back fence the first spring after I retired needed cutting back badly, and there was something satisfying about that kind of work. Physical, conclusive, the results immediately visible. You cut a thing back, and you can see exactly what you've done. Inside the house, things were less conclusive. The linen closet in the upstairs hall had been reorganized sometime in the second week of May. I discovered it on a Tuesday morning when I reached for a spare pillowcase and found that everything had been moved. The system, my system, which I will admit was more intuitive than logical, had been replaced with a more orderly arrangement. Labeled sections, things folded in thirds instead of halves. It was objectively more efficient. It was also not mine. I stood in front of the open closet for a moment. Then I closed it. Then I went downstairs and made coffee, and I used the voice again. It's a linen closet. She organized the linen closet. This is not a problem. The week after that, I came downstairs on a Saturday morning to find that the armchair had been moved. Frank's chair. It had sat in the corner of the living room by the west window for as long as I could remember. Since before Frank died, since the year we bought it at a consignment shop in Lake Oswego, and Frank carried it in through the front door and set it down and sat in it immediately, still in his coat, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has found the exact right thing. He had read every Steinbeck novel he ever owned in that chair, every Patrick O'Brian, every crossword puzzle he'd ever finished, which was most of them. I had not sat in it myself in 2 years, maybe 3, but it had been there, in its corner, in its light. Now it was in the basement. Raina had mentioned a few days before that the living room felt crowded, that the flow was off. I had nodded in the way I'd been nodding at things I didn't intend to actually address. I had not understood that nodding would be interpreted as agreement. I mentioned the chair to Danny that evening, gently, the way you bring up something that matters when you don't want to seem unreasonable. He looked uncomfortable. That particular uncomfortable expression he gets when he's caught between two things he doesn't know how to hold at once. "I'll talk to her," he said. I nodded. I thanked him. I went to bed. The chair stayed in the basement. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just furniture, that Frank was not in that chair. Frank was gone, and no arrangement of physical objects in a living room was going to change that, or honor it, or diminish it. I believed about half of that. I want to tell you about June Whitfield, because she matters to this story more than I knew at the time. June and I met in the fall of 1981 in the parking lot of a high school in Northeast Portland, where we were both doing our student teaching. She had locked her keys in her car, and I had a Slim Jim in my trunk. Don't ask. And by the time we'd gotten her door open, we had established that we liked each other. We have been friends for 42 years. She is the godmother of my son. She has a laugh that makes people at neighboring restaurant tables turn around to find the source of it, and she makes the best lemon cake I have ever eaten. And she is one of those rare people who will tell you the truth and make you feel loved while she does it. I called June in the second week of May, after the linen closet but before the chair. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Always," said June. "Am I being too sensitive?" June, unlike Carol, did not pause. She said, "Tell me what happened first." I told her. The towels, the closet, the general feeling of things shifting around me without my participation. June was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then, "Marge, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. Are you sure this is about the towels in the closet, or is it about the fact that someone else is in Frank's house?" I sat with that. "Both," I said finally. "Okay," June said. "That's an honest answer. Here's what I think. The feelings are real, and they deserve to be named, but before you decide what to do about them, you need to know which part you're actually responding to." That was June. Not dismissive, not entirely validating, just precise. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table, Frank's table, 6 chairs, and I tried to do what she'd suggested. I tried to separate the two threads, the grief thread and the boundary thread. The Frank is gone, and someone else is living in his house thread, which was mine to carry and couldn't be fixed by anything Raina did or didn't do. And the someone is changing my home without asking me thread, which was a different thing entirely. They were tangled. I could feel how tangled they were. And I understood, somewhere in that conversation, that I needed to be careful not to aim the grief thread at Raina and call it a boundary. I tried to be careful. I am not sure I always succeeded. June came to visit in late May, on a Saturday when Danny and Raina were both out. She walked through the front door and stopped in the hallway and looked around with the expression she gets when she's cataloging something. "New towels?" she said, spotting the dish towels through the kitchen doorway. "May," I said. Linen closet?" "Also May." She looked at me. "Frank's chair?" "Basement." June made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound that communicated a complete and considered opinion. We had lunch at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours. June asked questions and I answered them, and she listened the way she has always listened. Completely, without rushing me, without finishing my sentences. By the end of the afternoon, I felt scraped out and cleaner, the way you feel after you've finally said out loud the thing you've been carrying in your chest for weeks. I walked her to her car. She hugged me on the front porch and said, "Say something, Marge. To Danny, at minimum. This doesn't get better by itself." I said I would. I didn't. Not yet. I told myself there would be a better moment. I told myself things might settle on their own. I told myself for the last time that I was probably making it bigger than it was. In June, they had been there 3 months. The original timeline, just until June probably, had quietly expired. I brought it up on a Sunday evening when we'd had a good dinner and the mood seemed right, and it felt like the kind of moment where a reasonable conversation was possible. I mentioned carefully that we had originally talked about a few months and asked how their housing search was going. Raina looked at me across the table with an expression of complete composure. "The market hasn't improved," she said. "Not defensively, just factually. Leaving too soon would put us in a difficult financial position." She said it the way a person states something that is simply not up for discussion. Danny nodded. I nodded. I went and did the dishes. I stood at the kitchen sink and looked out at the dogwood tree in the backyard, the one Frank planted the week Danny was born, and I thought, Frank, what would you do here? I knew exactly what Frank would do. Frank would have said, calmly, clearly, and without drama, "We talked about June. It's June. What's the new plan?" And then he would have waited for an answer. I was not Frank. I was someone who had spent 28 years teaching other people's children to use their words and was finding it considerably harder to use her own. I washed the dishes. I dried them. I put them away. I told myself there was still time. July. 4 months in. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Danny in July, because it's important, and because I almost didn't include it. I almost edited it out of this story because it doesn't reflect entirely well on either of us. And there is a temptation, when you're telling your own story, to leave out the parts where you're not quite the person you want to be. But I said I was going to tell you the real version. Raina was at a work event, a Saturday conference downtown. Danny and I were in the kitchen, the late morning kind of quiet that belongs specifically to a house when only 2 people are in it. Danny made coffee, set a cup in front of me without asking, sat down. "Mom," he said. "I know." I looked at him. "I know what's happening. I see it." He turned his cup in his hands, both hands, the way Frank used to hold things when he was thinking carefully. "I don't know what to do about it." I said, "What do you see?" "I see Raina making changes, and I see you not saying anything, and I see the gap between those 2 things getting wider." He paused. "I see my wife making your house feel less like your home, and I don't know how to be in the middle of that." This was the most Danny had said about any of it in 4 months. I felt something release in my chest, the particular relief of being seen by someone who matters. "You're not in the middle, Danny," I said. "You're the person who brought her here. That's different from being in the middle." He looked at me. Something moved across his face. "I know," he said, quietly. "I know that." What he didn't tell me then, what I wouldn't find out until much later, after the birthday, after everything, was the full shape of what he knew. But I felt, sitting at the table that morning with the sun coming through the kitchen window and the dogwood visible in the backyard and the coffee getting cold, that something between Danny and me was being repaired. Slowly, one honest sentence at a time. He asked me to give him more time. I said I would. But I set a deadline. Not aloud, not to anyone. Just in my own chest. In the quiet. The way you do when you finally decide that patience has an edge. September, I thought. If nothing changes by September, I will say something that cannot be knotted away. August arrived, and with it, a long weekend in Bend. Carol had been asking me to visit since May, and I finally went. 4 days, her spare room, long dinners and longer walks, and the particular comfort of being somewhere that was completely mine to be a guest in, where no one would mistake me for anything else. I came home on a Monday. I knew something was different before I opened the door. There was a smell. Specific. Unmistakable. The chemical sweet smell of fresh paint. I stood in the front doorway. The hallway walls were sage green. A soft, muted, objectively lovely sage green. The woodwork was crisp and white. The whole thing looked magazine-ready. The kind of careful work that costs money and time and someone else's decision. I set my bag down on the floor. I did not move. Raina was at the kitchen table with her laptop. She looked up. "What do you think?" she said, and her voice had something in it that sounded genuinely like anticipation, like she was waiting for something good. "I thought the old color was looking tired," she added. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the many things I could say. Then I said, It's a nice color. And I turned and put the kettle on. That night I lay awake for a long time, not in anger, or not only in anger, in something harder to name. Part of it was grief. Grief for the walls that had been my walls for 27 years. The particular warm ivory I'd chosen with Frank in 1997, standing in the paint aisle at the hardware store, Frank holding up sample cards and squinting at them, and finally pointing to one and saying, that one looks like home." It had looked like home for 26 years. Now it looked like a magazine. But underneath the grief, there was something else. Something I didn't want to look at directly but couldn't quite look away from. The thought came to me slowly, the way uncomfortable thoughts do, edging in from the side. When did you give her permission to do this? And the answer I didn't want to say out loud even to myself, was... Every time I said nothing. I had been so careful for 5 months to be reasonable, to not be difficult, to not be the demanding mother-in-law who counted every small thing and kept a running tally. I had given every benefit of the doubt I had. I had talked myself out of reacting to things that deserved a reaction. And in doing all of that, I had done something I hadn't intended to do. I had made myself invisible. And if you make yourself invisible in your own home, you cannot be entirely surprised when someone else fills the space. I lay there in the dark, and I felt the strange, uncomfortable equality of that recognition. I had not caused what Raina was doing. I was not responsible for her choices, but I had not helped matters. My silence had been read as consent, and I had let that go on for 5 months because I was afraid. Afraid of conflict, afraid of damaging Danny's marriage, afraid of being labeled the difficult one. Fear dressed up as patience is still fear. I fell asleep just before 3. I did not feel better, but I felt, for the first time, clear. I called June 3 days after I got home from Bend. I told her about the hallway. June came over that Friday afternoon. She stood in the hallway and looked at the sage green walls for a long moment, and I watched her, making the same calculation I'd been making all week. The walls were genuinely beautiful, and that somehow made the whole thing worse. "She didn't ask you," June said. Not a question. She didn't ask me. We sat at the kitchen table. I made tea. The afternoon light came through the window the way it does in August in Oregon, warm and slightly golden, the kind of light that makes everything look better than it is. June wrapped both hands around her mug. She had an expression I recognized. The expression that means she has something to tell me, and she's deciding how. "Marge," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." I nodded. "About 3 months ago," June said, "Raina called me." I set my cup down. "She called me and asked about Frank, about the house, about how you were, about whether you were still grieving, whether you felt stuck here, whether you'd been able to move forward." June paused. "She asked me what would help you. What would make you feel like you could breathe again in this house?" I said nothing. I waited the way she'd asked me to. "She told me she wanted to do something for you. She said she'd been thinking about how the house still felt so much like Frank's. His things, his choices, his arrangement of everything. And she thought that if she could refresh it, update it, make it feel a little more like now instead of 15 years ago, that it might help you. She framed it as a gift, Marge. She genuinely framed it as a gift." The kitchen was very quiet. "I didn't tell you," June continued, "because I thought she meant well, and I didn't want to spoil it. I thought maybe she was right. Maybe a fresh coat of paint in the hallway would actually feel good. I thought I was staying out of it." She looked at me directly. "I was wrong. I should have told you, and I'm sorry." I sat with everything she'd said. Raina had called June 3 months ago, before the hallway, before the chair, before most of it. She had asked about me. She had asked what would help me. She had, in her own way, tried to understand me. And she had arrived at completely the wrong answer, and acted on it without asking me, and caused real harm. But the intention was not what I had thought it was. I had been so certain, for months, about what I was dealing with. A woman who needed to control spaces. A woman who was indifferent to what things meant to other people. A woman who was, at some level, simply taking over. And now June was sitting across from me with tea going cold between her hands, telling me that the woman I had been building in my head for 5 months had 3 months ago called my best friend to ask how to help me. "She's not wrong that I've been grieving," I said finally. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "No," said June, "she's not wrong about that. But she had no right to make those decisions for me." "No," said June again. "She didn't. An intention doesn't make a decision right. It just makes it more complicated." We sat there for a while. The light shifted. The tea went cold. "What do I do with this?" I asked. June looked at me with the particular expression she has had for 42 years when she is about to say the thing I need to hear and not the thing I want to hear. "I think," she said, "that you already know." June meant well telling me, but the truth she handed me that afternoon was heavier than either of us expected. Because now I had to decide, what do you do when the person who hurt you didn't mean to hurt you at all? That question followed me into October, into November, all the way to the morning of my birthday. What do you do when the person who hurt you didn't mean to hurt you at all? I turned it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling the weight of it, the edges, the places where it was smooth and the places where it wasn't. I had no clean answer. I still don't, not entirely. But I want to tell you what I did with that question, and what happened because of it, and what I finally understood standing at my own back door on a cold November morning with my hand on the handle and the sound of Raina's voice carrying across the yard. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. First, September, and the conversation I almost didn't have. The internal deadline I had set, September if nothing changes by September, arrived quietly, the way deadlines do when you've been hoping you won't have to honor them. Nothing had changed. The chair was still in the basement. The hallway was still sage green. The 6 months that had been 4 months that had been just until June probably had become 7 months with no end in sight and no plan on the table. I picked a Sunday afternoon. Danny was reading in the living room. Raina was at the kitchen table with her laptop. I made coffee, a deliberate act, something to do with my hands, and I sat down across from Raina and I said, "I'd like to talk with you about something." She closed her laptop, looked at me, waited, and I tried. I told her carefully about the chair, about the hallway, about the feeling that had been building since May of being a guest in my own home. I kept my voice even. I had rehearsed the broad strokes of it, the way I used to rehearse difficult conversations with students' parents, not scripting it, just knowing the shape of what I needed to say before I said it. Raina listened. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Margaret, I'm sorry if I made you feel that way. That was never my intention. I only wanted to make things better. For everyone." I sat with those words. "I'm sorry if I made you feel that way." I had said those exact words to students' parents myself once or twice in 28 years of teaching. I knew what they meant and what they didn't mean. They meant, I acknowledge that you are experiencing something. I do not acknowledge that I caused it. What struck me, sitting across from Raina in my own kitchen, was not the inadequacy of the apology. It was something else. It was the expression on her face while she said it, not calculating, not defensive, not performing. She looked genuinely like someone who believed she had apologized, who believed she had done the thing correctly. She didn't know. She didn't know that "I'm sorry if you felt that way" is not an apology. She wasn't withholding a real one. She simply had no model for what a real one looked like. That recognition sat in my chest like a stone. "Thank you," I said, because I didn't know what else to say, because the conversation I had prepared for, the one where I said my piece and Raina either acknowledged it or pushed back and we arrived somewhere new, was not the conversation I was in. I was in a conversation with someone who was doing her best with tools she'd never been given. That night I lay awake again. But this time the insomnia had a different quality. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was the particular exhaustion of a problem that keeps changing shape every time you think you have its edges. I called Carol the next morning. The apology wasn't real, I said. Not because she's dishonest, because she doesn't know how. Carol was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do with that? I don't know yet, I said. But I think I'm done waiting for something to change on its own. October arrived with the particular quality of Oregon October. Rain that feels like it has opinions. Light that turns the maples on Birchwood Lane, colors you forget are possible until they appear again. 3 things happened in October that I need to tell you about. The first was the sofa conversation. Raina brought it up at Sunday dinner, casually, looking at Danny rather than at me, which told me everything I needed to know about who she considered the relevant authority in that room. The sofa in the living room is really at the end of its life, she said. The springs are completely gone. I've been looking at some options. There's a sectional at the furniture store on Burnside that would actually work really well in that space. I set my fork down. I did it quietly, without drama, but I set it down. That sofa belonged to Frank and me, I said. I'm not interested in replacing it. Raina looked at me with that expression, patient, faintly still, as though she were waiting for the emotional portion to conclude so the practical conversation could resume. I understand it has memories, she said. But Margaret, the springs are gone. It's not really functional anymore. It's functional enough for me, I said. Danny was looking at his plate. The sofa stayed. But the conversation left a mark. Not because of what was said, but because of what I noticed saying it. I had not apologized. I had not softened it. I had not followed my own statement with, but of course that's just my feeling. Or, I know it's not very practical. I had simply said what was true, and then I had held it. It was a small thing, but it was the first time in 7 months that I had held something. The second thing that happened in October was that Danny came to find me. Raina was at a work dinner on a Wednesday evening. Danny knocked on the door of my study. I was reading, half asleep in Frank's chair, which I had moved back upstairs myself one Saturday morning without asking anyone's permission. And he came in and sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Mom, can we talk?" We talked for 2 hours. Danny told me things he hadn't told me before. He told me that he had known, since June, that things had gone past what was comfortable. He had watched it happen and told himself it would resolve on its own, and then told himself that getting involved would only make things worse, and then told himself that I was handling it, and then had the conversation with me in July, and told himself that conversation was enough. I kept finding reasons not to do the next thing, he said. I'm good at that. I've always been good at that. He rubbed the back of his neck. Frank's gesture, on Frank's son, in Frank's house. It was almost too much. The part I haven't told you, he said, is that in the spring, before we moved in, Raina found an apartment on Division Street. Decent size, good location. The price was manageable if we were careful. I looked at him. She wanted to take it, he said. She was ready to take it, and I talked her out of it. The room was very quiet. I told her we'd save faster if we stayed with you. I told her it would only be a few months. I told her you wouldn't mind. He paused. I made that decision for both of you. I didn't ask you. I didn't really ask her. I just decided. I sat with that for a long moment. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I've been telling myself it wasn't my fault, that I was caught in the middle, that I was managing a difficult situation. He looked at me directly. And I wasn't. I created it. I put 2 people I love in an impossible position because it was convenient for me, and I've been hiding behind the word middle ever since. I reached across and put my hand on his, left it there. Frank would be proud of you for saying that, I said. Even now, especially now. Danny made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Took me long enough. Most important things do, I said, he said. We sat there for a while in the quiet of the study, in the light of the reading lamp, with the rain coming down outside the way it does in Oregon October. I felt something settle between us. Not everything fixed, not the situation resolved, but the 2 of us on the same side of it for the first time. What are we going to do? He asked. I'm going to say something, I said. Clearly, To both of you. Soon. He nodded. I'll back you up. I know you will, I said. But Danny, you're not backing me up. You're doing your own part. There's a difference. He thought about that. Then he nodded again, differently. The second nod, the one that meant he understood. The third thing that happened in October was that Raina told us about the birthday party. She mentioned it at breakfast on a Tuesday, the way she mentioned things she had already decided, in the tone of someone sharing a plan rather than proposing one. My birthday falls on November 14th. I have never been someone who makes a production of it. I observe it. I have people I love around a table. I eat well, and I laugh, and I go to bed grateful. That has always been enough. Raina said she was planning a dinner, something bigger than usual. She had some colleagues in town that week, and there were a few couples she and Danny wanted us to meet, and she thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to do something really celebratory. A real birthday, she said, not just the usual small group. I looked at her across the breakfast table. I appreciate the thought, I said, but I prefer to keep it simple. Carol, June, a few people from the neighborhood. Raina nodded in the way she nodded at things she did not intend to accommodate. I recognized that nod. I had been watching it for 8 months. I said nothing more that morning, but I noted it, and I added it to the shape of what I knew was coming. November 14th arrived on a Thursday. I woke at 5:30, as I always do, and lay for a moment in the particular quiet of an early morning when a house is still. I looked at the ceiling. I thought 63 years old. I thought about Frank, the way I always do on my birthday, the way I expect I always will. I thought about the version of this day I had imagined. Carol arriving in the afternoon, June with her lemon cake, the big oak table with the people who actually knew me seated around it. I got up, put on my robe, went downstairs. Raina was already in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter with her phone in one hand and what appeared to be a catering list on the screen. There were grocery delivery bags already stacked by the back door. There was a notepad with columns of names and a timeline broken into 30-minute increments. I stood in the kitchen doorway, and I looked at all of it. "How many people?" I said. Raina looked up. She seemed for a moment genuinely pleased that I was awake, genuinely ready to share the plan. 30, she said. "I've kept it manageable. Danny's supervisor and his wife, 4 colleagues from my team, 3 couples we've been meaning to have over, and a few others. It's going to be wonderful, Margaret. Everyone is so excited to celebrate you." 30 people in my home on my birthday. 30 people I had not invited, had not agreed to, had not been consulted about. I heard my mother's voice then. She died 20 years ago, but I hear her sometimes, the way you hear the people who shaped you. Not as memory exactly, more as a quality of knowing. She had a saying she used on me when I was young and conflict-averse in ways that cost me. She would say, "Margaret, a person can only walk on you if you lie down first." I had been lying down for 8 months. I looked at Raina and I said evenly, "I told you I wanted something small." She did not look up from her list. "You'll enjoy it. It's going to be lovely." "Raina," she looked up then, "I'm going to need you to cancel it." Something moved across her face, quick, private, the expression of someone recalculating. Then it was gone. "The food is already ordered," she said. "Then we'll have a lot of leftovers," I said, and I turned and went back upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed and breathed for a while. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt shaky, the way you feel after you've done something that matters, but that you have been afraid to do for a long time. My hands were not entirely steady. My heart was going faster than it should. I called Carol. "It happened," I said. "Tell me," Carol said. I told her. When I finished, Carol said, "Good. Now tell Danny." I called June. "Bring the lemon cake," I said. "Just us, tonight." "I'll be there at 6, June said. "What time do you want me to actually be there?" 5:30, I said. June laughed. That laugh that turns heads in restaurants. Then I went downstairs to find my son. Danny was in the kitchen, pouring coffee. Raina was not in the room. He looked at me, and he already knew, the way children of attentive mothers always know when something has shifted. "Sit down," I said. "I need to talk to you." I told him everything, not just the birthday, all of it in order, from the dish towels in April to the chair in May, to the hallway in August, to the sofa conversation to this morning. 30 guests on my birthday in my home without my consent. I told him clearly. I told him without accusation and without performance. And then I told him what I had not yet said out loud to anyone. "I love you. And I'm not angry at Raina, not really. I think she is doing her best with what she has. But Danny, I have been disappearing in my own home for 8 months, and it needs to stop." Danny was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'll take care of the party." "I know you will," I said. "But Danny, what I need is not just for you to fix today. I need us to talk, all 3 of us, about what happens next, and soon." He nodded, the second nod, the one that meant he understood. That evening, November 14th, my 63rd birthday, Carol. June with her lemon cake and a bottle of wine she'd been saving for a good occasion. 2 neighbors, Margaret Walsh from 3 doors down, who has known me since Danny was in middle school, and Paul Okafor from across the street, who once helped me get a raccoon out of my garage at 11 o'clock at night and has been a friend ever since. 5 people. Frank's table with 5 chairs occupied and 1 empty, the one that has been empty for 15 years and that I have never been able to bring myself to remove. Raina sat at the far end of the table and was very quiet, polite when spoken to. She ate neatly, responded correctly, did not look at me directly for most of the evening. I had expected to feel guilty about that. I found when I checked that I did not because I didn't care, I did care, but because guilt requires that you have done something wrong, and I had not done anything wrong. I had asked for what was mine to ask for in a place that was mine to ask for it. That is not a thing that deserves guilt. June knocked over her wine glass somewhere around 9 o'clock, right in the middle of a story that had the whole table leaning forward, and the wine spread across Frank's tablecloth in a slow red bloom, and Carol laughed so hard she had to put her fork down. And it was, genuinely, entirely a lovely evening. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, I went out to the garden. The November garden is not a beautiful thing. It is a stripped-down, honest thing, the bones of it, without the softness. I find I prefer it in some ways. You can see what you're actually working with. I was deadheading the last of the black-eyed Susans along the back fence when I heard Raina's voice. She was on the porch, just inside the back door, on the phone. Her voice was low, the kind of low that isn't quite a whisper, the kind that means the conversation is private, but she hadn't thought to check whether anyone was in the garden. I wasn't eavesdropping. I want to be clear about that. I was 12 feet away with a pair of garden shears and a bucket, doing what I always do in the garden in November. I heard her voice and I stilled, not wanting to interrupt, not wanting to make her feel watched. I should have made a noise, rattled the shears, cleared my throat, given her a way to know I was there. I didn't. Because the first words I caught stopped me. "I don't know what I did wrong. I thought I was helping. I thought if the house looked better, if it felt more like now and less like, I don't know, less like a museum, I thought she'd be glad." A pause. Whoever was on the other end was speaking. I could not hear that side. "I know," Raina said. Her voice had changed. Stripped of the composure, the precision, it sounded younger somehow, uncertain in a way I had never heard it. "I know she wants us to leave. I know that's what's coming. I thought we'd found something, you know? I thought she might ask us to stay." Another pause. "I just wanted somewhere that felt like mine," Raina said. "I thought if I could make it beautiful enough, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's crazy." Her voice broke slightly on that last word, just slightly, then she steadied. I stood in the garden with my garden shears, and I did not move. The back door clicked shut. She had gone inside. I stood there for a long time after. The November garden around me, stripped and honest. The dogwood Frank planted the week Danny was born, bare now, its branches against the gray sky. The wisteria cut back along the fence, waiting for spring. I just wanted somewhere that felt like mine. This is the thing about the truth when it arrives unexpectedly. It doesn't care about your timing. It doesn't care that you had a plan, a script, a careful architecture of understanding that you'd built over 8 months. It lands where it lands, and it rearranges everything. And you have to stand in the rearranged version of things and figure out what to do next. I had spent 8 months believing I understood what Raina was doing and why. I had revised that understanding twice, once in April when I saw the envelope, once in August when June told me about the phone call. And I had arrived, after those revisions, at what I thought was the complete picture. A woman with a difficult history, acting from good intentions, who had nonetheless caused real harm and needed to be met with a clear, firm limit. That picture was not wrong, but it was not complete. Because it was missing this, she had wanted to belong here, not to take the house from me, not to erase Frank, or erase me, or establish control for its own sake. She had wanted, in the only language she had, which was the language of making spaces beautiful and orderly and looked after, she had wanted to become part of something, and she had gone about it in entirely the wrong way and caused real hurt, and none of that was changed by understanding her reasons. But the reasons changed me. The reasons changed how I was going to walk back into that house and have the conversation that needed to happen. I stood at the back door with my hand on the handle, and I understood for the first time that I had been fighting the wrong battle. The question was never who owned this house. The question was, what do you do with that understanding now? A fictional story, inspired by real experiences. There's a difference between forgiving someone and giving them your house. I had confused the two for a long time. I think a lot of people do. Especially people who were raised to be kind, to smooth things over before they get sharp, to absorb friction rather than create it. Especially people who have spent their lives showing up for others and have come to believe, quietly and without examining it, that showing up means never saying no. But here is what I have learned at 63 in the hard way that most important things are learned. Giving without limits is not generosity. It is the slow erasure of yourself, and you cannot give from an empty house. I knew that, standing at the back door with my hand on the handle and my daughter-in-law's voice still in my ears. I knew it in my body the way you know things when they finally stop being ideas and become facts. Solid, settled, not going anywhere. The question was what to do next, and the answer, when I found it, was simpler than I expected, and harder. I gave myself the rest of that Saturday, not to cool down. I was past anger. Not to talk myself into anything. I was past that, too. I gave myself that day simply to sit with the full picture before I walked into the conversation that needed to happen. I made tea, sat at Frank's table, took out the notepad I still keep in the kitchen drawer, a habit from 28 years of teaching, the kind of habit that outlasts the job. And I wrote 3 things. A firm end date. No more changes without my explicit agreement. A different way of being in this house for whatever time remains. I looked at those 3 lines for a long while. They were clear. They were fair. They were, I realized with a feeling I can only describe as tired clarity, things I could have said in April, in May, in June. Things that might have saved 8 months of slow erosion and late nights, and standing at kitchen sinks looking at backyards and wondering how I had become a guest in my own life. But I hadn't been ready in April. Readiness is not a failure of character. It is the result of a process. And sometimes the process takes 8 months and requires a foster care envelope on a kitchen table and a best friend's confession and a phone call overheard in a November garden before it is complete. I called Carol. I know what I need to say, I told her, and I know how. How? Carol asked. Not as someone who is angry, not as someone who is hurt, as someone who lives here. Carol was quiet for a moment, then told, That's it, Marge. That's exactly it. I called June after. Sunday night, I said. Come over. Wine or tea? Both, I said. June came at 7 and stayed until nearly midnight. We didn't spend those hours rehearsing what I would say on Monday. I had said what needed saying to myself already, and saying it again would only make it smaller. Instead, we talked about everything else. About a former student of mine June had run into who was now improbably a ceramicist in Ashland. About Carol's ongoing battle with the deer that destroyed her garden every August without remorse. About Frank, the good Frank stories, the funny ones. The time he tried to fix the kitchen faucet and flooded the entire downstairs and stood in 6 inches of water reading the instruction manual with the particular composure of a man who believed that the answer to any problem was simply to find the right page. I needed those hours. I needed to remember who I was before I walked into Monday. Not Marge, who had been quietly disappearing for 8 months. Not Marge braced for a confrontation, but just Marge, at her own table, with her oldest friend, laughing about Frank and the instruction manual and the 6 inches of water. June left at 11:30. I washed the glasses, dried them, put them in the cabinet where they belonged. Then I went to bed and I slept, which surprised me. Monday morning, I asked Danny and Raina to sit with me after breakfast. I want to tell you about this conversation in full, not a summary, the full thing, because I think the details matter, because I think sometimes people imagine that the moment you finally say the necessary thing, the other person simply receives it, and everything shifts cleanly into place. That is not what happened. They sat across from me at Frank's table, Danny with both hands around his coffee mug, Raina with her hands in her lap, composed, waiting. The November light came through the kitchen window the way it does that time of year, low and pale, the kind of light that shows you everything exactly as it is. I started with the thing I hadn't planned to say, the thing that had moved to the front of the line on its own, somewhere between the garden on Saturday and this moment. Raina, I said, I want to tell you something before anything else. She looked at me. For the first time since August, her expression was not guarded. I heard part of your phone call on Saturday, in the garden. I wasn't trying to, but I heard enough. Something moved across her face, raw and quick, gone almost before I could name it. I'm not telling you that to embarrass you, I said. I'm telling you because I want you to know that I understand something now that I didn't before. I know you weren't trying to take my home from me. I think you were trying to find a way into it. And I think those are very different things. Raina was looking at the table. But understanding that doesn't change what happened. The chair was Frank's. The hallway was mine. My birthday was mine to decide. Those things mattered. They still matter. Understanding where something comes from doesn't make its effects less real. It just changes how I need to talk about it. I paused, let it settle. Then I told them what I needed. A firm end date, March 1st, 1 full year. I'll help where I can between now and then. But March 1st, you need to be in your own place. Danny nodded, the real nod. No more changes to this house without my explicit agreement. Not paint, not furniture, not the organization of anything. Ask me. I may say yes, but the decision is mine. Raina looked up. And my birthday next year will be what I want it to be. That's not negotiable. A silence. Then Raina said, The market hasn't... I held up one hand. Flat. The gesture I had used for 28 years with teenagers who were trying to redirect a conversation that needed to stay where it was. It worked on Raina the same way it had always worked on teenagers. She stopped. I've heard about the market, I sadly said. I understand it's difficult, but it is not a problem that gets solved by staying in my house indefinitely. You need to make a plan, a real one, with a real date. Raina looked at me. I could see the calculation, not the cold calculation I had spent months misreading, but something more desperate. The calculation of someone trying to find a foothold. Then she said something I did not expect. What if we can't find something by March? The room was very quiet. Then you'll find somewhere temporary, I said, the way people do, but you will not still be here in April. Another silence, longer this time. Raina, Danny said, quietly, just her name. But the way he said it, steady, certain, not a question, told her everything she needed to know about where he stood. She looked at him. Something passed between them that I was not meant to see entirely. Then she turned back to me. I don't know how to apologize correctly, she said. I've been told that before. I still don't always... I don't know how to do it right. The room was very still. I know, I said. I could see that. That's not an excuse, but I took it into account. I'm sorry, Margaret. Her voice was flat and plain and stripped of everything rehearsed. Not the version I said before, this one. It was not elegant. It had no shape to it, but it was honest in a way that none of the earlier versions had been. And honesty, even clumsy honesty, is not nothing. Thank you, I said. Then Danny said, She's right, Raina, about all of it. He looked at his wife. I talked you out of that Division Street apartment because it was easier for me. I made that decision for both of you without asking either of you. That wasn't fair. He looked at me. And I watched what was happening here for months and chose not to get involved because staying out felt safer than being in. That wasn't fair either. He paused. I'm sorry, Mom. 3 words. Quiet. But they landed the way things land when they've been true for a long time and are finally being said out loud, with a kind of weight that doesn't dissipate, that stays in the room. Toward the end of it, after the silences had done their work and the air had changed to something easier to breathe, Raina asked one more question. Can the walls stay? The hallway? I looked at her for a moment. The hallway I had come home to in August with my bag still on my shoulder and stood in the smell of fresh paint, and felt something in me go hard and cold. The color I had not chosen. The decision that had not been mine. The color I had, quietly and without ceremony, gotten used to. Yes, I said. I've gotten used to it. The corner of Raina's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more honest than that. The 3 weeks between that conversation and the end of November were not easy ones. I want to tell you that because the version of this story where one honest conversation fixes everything is a lie, and I promised you the real version. Raina was not cold exactly, but she was careful in a way that made the house feel careful. Measured words, careful distances, a politeness so precise it had edges. There were evenings when the silence at dinner had a texture to it, and I sat with my soup and my bread, and I thought, have I broken something that cannot be repaired? Those evenings were hard. On one of them, late in November, I called Carol after dinner and I said, I think she hates me. Carol said, She doesn't hate you. She's grieving. Grieving what? The version of things she thought she was building, Carol said. Give her time. You've had 8 months to arrive at the truth. She's had 3 weeks. I sat with that. You're right, I said. I usually am, Carol said. You should call me sooner next time. They found a rental unit on Division Street, not the same building Raina had found in the spring, but the same neighborhood. 3rd floor, a small balcony that caught the afternoon sun. Enough room. They moved out February 15th, 2 weeks before my deadline. The morning of the move, I came downstairs early and made a large pot of coffee and set it on the counter with cups and told them to take what they needed. It was a small thing. But small things, I have learned, are often the ones that mean the most when language isn't quite enough. I helped pack. This was, I will admit, a decision I second-guessed. Part of me thought, give them space. Let them do it themselves. Don't hover over a leaving you initiated. But another part, the part that had been a teacher for 28 years, the part that knew that showing up matters, said be here, be present. This is how you show that the ending of one arrangement is not the ending of the relationship. So I wrapped glasses in newspaper and labeled boxes and carried things down the stairs, and Raina and I worked mostly in silence. The kind that means both people have said what needed saying and are now simply present with each other without the weight of what's unsaid. It was, in its way, the most comfortable we had ever been together. Late in the afternoon, the guest room was almost empty. Danny was downstairs coordinating with the truck. Raina was doing a final walkthrough. I was standing in the hallway when she came out of the closet carrying something. I knew what it was before I saw it clearly. The photograph of Frank and me at Crater Lake. 1989. The one that had been in this hallway for 20 years before it was moved to my bedroom in April. For safekeeping, she'd said, so it wouldn't fade in the light. Raina stood in the hallway holding the photograph. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the wall, the sage green wall, her color, the one I had said she could keep. Then she held the photograph out to me. "This belongs here," she said. "On this wall. It always did." She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at the wall, at the space where it had always hung. I understood, in the way you understand things that don't arrive in words, that this was the real apology, not the one at the kitchen table, which had been honest and necessary and real in its own way. This was the one that came from somewhere deeper. This was Raina standing in a hallway she had repainted without permission and saying, "I see what I did. I'm undoing what I can. You can't undo paint. You can't undo 8 months. But you can return a photograph to its wall, and sometimes that is enough to build something new from." I took it from her. Our fingers touched briefly on the frame, just briefly, just for a moment, and she let go and I held it, and neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then, "Thank you, Raina." She nodded once, went back down the hall, finished her walkthrough. After the truck pulled away, after Danny's long hug at the door, after Raina shook my hand, and then, just before she turned to go, briefly, almost imperceptibly, pressed her palm flat against my arm for a single second, the way someone might touch a wall for balance before stepping into open space. After the sound of the engine faded down Birchwood Lane and the street went quiet, I stood in the hallway alone. I hung Frank's photograph back in its place. Crater Lake, 1989. Frank laughing. The water impossibly blue behind us. I stepped back and looked at it. At him. At us. So young, so certain of everything ahead of us. "There you are," I said. And I meant Frank. And I meant us. And I think in some way I'm still working out. I meant myself. May. The dogwood bloomed. It blooms every year. Small white flowers that seem improbable until they appear and then seem inevitable. Frank planted it 34 years ago, the week Danny was born. He said he was planting it for the yard. I think he was planting it for this. For a morning in May, when his wife would be sitting in his chair by the west window with her coffee, watching those flowers open, and would feel, for the first time in a long time, nothing more complicated than grateful. My phone buzzed on the side table. A text from an unsaved number that turned out to be Raina. New phone, hadn't transferred contacts, which was exactly like her, efficient in every department except the ones that require a certain emotional patience. "Danny told me about your apple crisp. We're having people over Saturday for a housewarming. Could I have the recipe?" I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and looked at the dogwood for a moment. Then I picked the phone back up and typed the full recipe. The apples, the brown sugar, the oat topping, all of it. And at the bottom I wrote, "One thing Frank always insisted on, a pinch of good sea salt in the topping. He said it was the difference between a dessert and a memory. He was right about most things." I sent it. 3 minutes later, a small heart emoji came back. Nothing else, just the heart. With Raina, I was beginning to understand. A small heart is not a small thing. I want to say one more thing before I finish. Not a lesson. I'm not interested in lessons, and I've been suspicious of them since I was in a classroom and watched too many students write down the moral of a story without feeling any of it. Just something true. If you are watching this and you recognize something in it, if you have been lying down when you should be standing up, if you have been using silence as a kindness when really it is a fear, if there is a version of yourself you have been slowly letting someone else erase because it felt easier than the conversation that needed to happen, it is not too late. It is not too late to say the thing, to hold the line, to remember who built the house and whose name is on it and whose voice matters most inside those walls. You are not asking too much when you ask to be seen in the space you created. You are asking exactly enough. And the relationships that are real, the ones actually worth having, will not break when you ask for it. They will expand to make room. The dogwood petals will fall in another week. They always do. 10 days of bloom, then gone until next year. Frank knew that when he planted it. He planted it anyway. That is the thing about promises. You make them knowing they'll be tested, knowing winter will come, knowing there will be years that are harder than others, years when the branches are bare and the ground is frozen and it is genuinely difficult to believe in spring. You plant the tree anyway. You stay. I pick up my coffee. I look at Frank's photograph in the hallway. I look at the dogwood in the yard, bright and brief and absolutely certain of itself. And I say what I say every morning now, to the house and the yard and the man who built both, the man who planted a tree and called it a promise. Good morning, Frank.